On the afternoon of November 14, 1991, in the Fellowship Hall of Bethel Lutheran Church in Cedar Bluffs, Nebraska, a man named Thomas Hendricks did something that would be talked about in that county for the next 30 years. He tore his father's will in half, not in private, not in the lawyer's office, right there in front of 47 people who had just finished burying Walter Hendricks, a man who had farmed 400 acres of prime Nebraska bottomland for over 4 decades without ever owing a dime to any bank. The will left everything to Thomas. The land, the equipment, the house, even the old International Harvester 1066 that Walter had babied since 400 acres of paid-off land in 1991, during a time when farms across the Midwest were still being auctioned off by the hundreds. It was the kind of inheritance that could set a family up for generations, and Thomas Hendricks tore it in 2 pieces, dropped both halves on the floor next to the coffee urn, and walked out of the church without saying a single word. His mother, Margaret, sat frozen in her chair by the window. She didn't cry. She didn't call after him. She just closed her eyes and nodded once, like she'd been waiting 34 years for this exact moment. Now, to understand what happened in that fellowship hall, we need to go back to a different Nebraska, back to 1957, before Thomas was even born, because the truth about Walter Hendricks and those 400 acres had been locked in a shoebox on the top shelf of Margaret's closet since before her son took his first breath. Thomas Hendricks was born in March of 1958, in a farmhouse 2 miles east of Cedar Bluffs. His earliest memories were of watching his father work the deliberate way Walter moved through the barn, the silence he kept during meals, the way his hands were never still. Walter Hendricks was not a warm man. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm. He gave instructions, not conversations. He nodded approval, never spoke it. In 20 years of working alongside his father, Thomas could count on one hand the number of times Walter had said he was proud of him. The farm was everything to Walter, 400 acres of river-bottom land that had been in the family since his own grandfather homesteaded it in 8. By the time Thomas was old enough to drive a tractor, Walter had paid off every penny of debt, owned every piece of equipment free and clear, and had enough cash reserves to weather any storm. This was unusual. Even in the 1960s, most farmers carried some debt. But Walter Hendricks had a rule he repeated like scripture: never owe money on land. Buy it outright or don't buy it at all. Thomas grew up believing this was simply his father's conservative nature, the old way of doing things, a philosophy passed down through generations of Hendricks men who had survived the Depression, the droughts, the bad years. He didn't know the real reason. Not yet. Let me pause here and tell you about the mailbox. At the end of the Hendricks' gravel driveway, there stood a mailbox that Walter had built himself in 19. It was nothing special, just a standard rural mailbox on a cedar post. But it had one unusual feature. On the side, burned into the wood with a branding iron, were 2 sets of initials, WH, and beneath it, almost hidden by weathering, the letters RK. When Thomas was 7 years old, he asked his father what RK stood for. Walter's face went tight, and he said it was a mistake from when he was learning to use the brand. The wood was scrap, and he hadn't bothered to fix it. Thomas accepted this explanation. Children do. But he noticed that every year, on the same date in October, his father would walk down to that mailbox alone, stand there for 10 or 15 minutes, and then walk back. He never took any mail. He never put any mail in. He just stood there, looking at those initials. Thomas asked his mother about it once, when he was 12. Margaret's face changed, just for a moment, into something Thomas didn't recognize. Then she smiled and said his father was just checking the post was still solid. These were the seeds. Small, buried, almost invisible. They would take 34 years to break through the soil. The 1970s arrived, and with them, the greatest boom in American agricultural history. Grain prices soared. Land values doubled, then tripled. Farmers who had struggled for decades suddenly found themselves, on paper at least, wealthy men. Thomas was 18 in 1976 when he graduated high school and told his father he wanted to stay on the farm. Walter nodded, just once, and the next morning, Thomas was driving the combine like he'd been doing it his whole life. The years between 1976 and 1980 were good ones. Thomas worked alongside his father 6 days a week, learning every inch of those 400 acres. He learned which fields drained well and which ones held water. He learned where the soil was sandy and where it ran to clay. He learned his father's system, the meticulous record-keeping, the cash reserves, the absolute refusal to borrow money, even when the banks were practically begging farmers to take loans. In 1979, Thomas met a woman named Linda at a church supper in neighboring Dodge County. She was a school teacher from Fremont, with dark hair and a laugh that made Thomas forget how to form sentences. They married in June of 1980, and Linda moved into a small house on the north end of the Hendricks property that Walter helped them fix up. That same year, Thomas noticed something strange. A man came to visit his father. Thomas was working in the equipment shed when a pickup truck he didn't recognize pulled into the yard. An older man got out, maybe 60, maybe older, with a weathered face and a limp in his left leg. Walter came out of the house and the two men talked by the grain bins for almost an hour. Thomas couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw the way his father stood. Shoulders hunched, head down like a man receiving bad news. When the stranger finally left, Walter walked to the mailbox and stood there until dark. That night at supper, Thomas asked who the visitor was. Walter said it was nobody, just someone asking for directions. Margaret said nothing. She kept her eyes on her plate, and her hands trembled slightly as she cleared the dishes. Now here's where I need you to understand something about what happened next, because the 1980s broke a lot of men who were better prepared than most. The farm crisis of the 1980s didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in like a sickness. First, the export markets collapsed. Then the grain prices fell. Then the land values, those paper fortunes that had made everyone feel so wealthy, dropped 30, 40, 50%. Farmers who had borrowed against their land in the boom years suddenly found themselves underwater. The collateral wasn't worth what they owed. Banks called in loans. Auctions multiplied across the countryside like a plague. Thomas watched it happen to their neighbors one by one. The Mullers the Andersons the big Swenson operation, nearly 2,000 acres, went under by 1986. Thomas had attended so many farm auctions that he knew the auctioneer's rhythm by heart, but not the Hendricks farm, never the Hendricks farm, because Walter Hendricks didn't owe anyone a single dollar. The crisis that destroyed his neighbors passed over his land like the angel of death over a marked door. While other men were losing everything, Walter simply tightened his belt, reduced his expenses, and waited for prices to recover. Thomas began to understand, during those years, just how valuable his father's philosophy really was. The debt-free farm wasn't just a preference, it was survival. It was the difference between keeping your land and watching strangers bid on your grandfather's equipment. He began to respect his father in a new way, to see the stubbornness not as rigidity, but as wisdom. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the philosophy wasn't born from wisdom at all. It was born from guilt. The stranger came back in Thomas was 37 now, with 2 children of his own, a boy named Daniel and a girl named Sarah. Linda had given up teaching to help on the farm, and the small house on the north end of the property had become a real home. It was October when the pickup truck returned. The same truck, 5 years older, driven by the same man with the limp. This time Thomas was closer, just behind the grain elevator, and he could hear fragments of the conversation. The old man's voice was thin but hard. "Promised me, Walter. You promised." His father's reply was too low to hear. "My boy would have had this land. My boy." Then Walter's voice, louder now. "Your boy is dead, Ray. Dead for 30 years. Nothing I do changes that." The old man said something else, something that made Walter flinch like he'd been struck. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. Walter stood by the grain bins for a long time. Then he walked to the mailbox. Then he went inside and didn't come out again until morning. That night, Thomas asked his mother directly, "Who was that man? Who is Ray? What happened 30 years ago?" Margaret Hendricks looked at her son for a long moment. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Some things are buried for a reason, Thomas. Let them stay buried. For your father's sake, and for yours, and because Thomas loved his mother, and because he still believed there were some truths that were better left alone, he didn't ask again. But he didn't forget either. The name Ray, the initials RK, a boy who would have had this land. These pieces lodged in his mind like splinters. Too deep to remove, too sharp to ignore. If you're still with me, I want you to think about something. Think about the stories we tell ourselves about our own families, the histories we inherit without question, the land we walk on every day, never knowing what's buried beneath our feet. Thomas Hendricks had spent his entire life on that farm. He knew every fence line, every drainage ditch, every tree. But he didn't know the truth about how his father came to own it. That truth had been waiting in a shoebox for 34 years, and it was about to come out. Walter Hendricks died on November 11th, 19. He was 73 years old. His heart gave out while he was checking the cattle in the north pasture, the same pasture his grandfather had fenced in 18. Thomas found him an hour later, lying in the grass beside the stock tank, looking up at the gray Nebraska sky. The funeral was 3 days later. Half the county came, not because Walter had been beloved, but because he had been respected. A man who had survived when others hadn't. A man who had kept his land. After the burial, everyone gathered in the fellowship hall for the reception. Coffee and casseroles, handshakes and murmured condolences. The rituals that rural communities have performed for generations. Thomas was standing by the window, accepting sympathies he barely heard, when his mother appeared at his elbow. "There's something I need to give you," she said quietly, "before the lawyer reads the will. Something you need to see first." She pressed a key into his hand. A small brass key, old and tarnished. "Top shelf of my closet. The shoebox with the red lid. I should have shown you years ago. I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry." Then she walked away to greet more mourners, leaving Thomas standing there with that key burning in his palm like a coal. He told himself he would wait. Wait until after the reception, after the will was read, after everyone went home. But he couldn't. The key was too heavy. The questions were too old. He slipped out the side door of the church, drove the 2 miles back to the farmhouse, and climbed the stairs to his parents' bedroom for the first time in 30 years. The shoebox was exactly where she said it would be. Red lid, worn at the corners, held shut with a rubber band so old it crumbled when he touched it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellow with age, written in handwriting Thomas didn't recognize. And beneath the letters, a photograph. 2 young men standing in front of a barn. One was Walter Hendricks. Thomas recognized his father's sharp features, softened by youth. The other was a stranger, tall, dark-haired, with a smile that seemed to light up the faded photograph. On the back, in his father's handwriting, "Walter and Ray, spring 19... Partners. Partners." Thomas sat on the edge of his parents' bed and began to read. The letters told a story that dismantled everything Thomas thought he knew about his father, his family, and the land he had worked his entire life. In 1955, Walter Hendricks was 27 years old and broke. His father had died the year before, leaving nothing but debts and 160 acres of worn-out farmland that wouldn't support a family. Walter was ready to sell, ready to give up on farming altogether and move to Omaha to work in the meatpacking plants. Then he met Ray Kellerman. Ray was 25, the son of a farmer from the next county over. He had saved nearly $15,000 working oil fields in Texas, a fortune in those days, and he was looking for a partner, someone who knew Nebraska soil, someone who could teach him the land. They made a deal. Ray would provide the capital. Walter would provide the knowledge and the labor. Together they would buy the 240 acres adjacent to Walter's struggling farm, combining them into a viable operation of 400 acres. The agreement was simple. They would be equal partners. When one of them married and had children, the partnership would dissolve, and they would split the land 50. For 2 years they worked side by side. The letters, Ray's letters to his mother back in Texas, described a friendship that went beyond business. Walter teaching Ray to read the soil. Ray showing Walter how to fix engines. 2 young men building something together, planning a future. Then in the spring of 1957, everything changed. Ray Kellerman was driving back from a meeting at the bank in Fremont when a truck ran a stop sign on Highway 6. The collision killed Ray instantly. He was 27 years old. He had never married. He had no will. And because the partnership had never been legally formalized, because they had trusted each other enough to shake hands instead of sign papers, the land was in Walter's name, all 400 acres. Ray's father, the old man with the limp, the man who had visited twice, had tried for years to get Walter to honor the original agreement, to give the Kellerman family their rightful 200 acres. He had letters from Ray describing the partnership. He had witnesses who remembered the handshake, but he had no legal standing. And Walter Hendricks, the man who preached about honor and debt and doing things the right way, had kept every acre. The guilt had eaten at him for 34 years. That's why he never borrowed money, not because of wisdom, but because he couldn't bear to owe anyone anything else. That's why he stood at the mailbox every October, staring at the initials he had burned into the wood to remember the friend he had betrayed. That's why he had built his entire philosophy of farming around a principle that was really just an attempt to pay penance for a sin he could never confess. Thomas sat in his parents' bedroom with those letters in his lap, and he felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything he had admired about his father was a lie. The debt-free legacy wasn't wisdom, it was guilt. The land that was supposed to be his birthright had been stolen from a dead man's family. He didn't remember driving back to the church. He didn't remember walking into the fellowship hall. He only remembered standing there, with the will in his hands, looking at the faces of people who respected his father, and feeling something inside him turn to stone. Thomas. The lawyer was speaking to him. Thomas, are you ready for me to read the... Thomas tore the will in half. The sound of it, that dry, final rip, silenced every conversation in the room. 47 people turned to look at him. Someone dropped a coffee cup. His aunt let out a small cry. Thomas dropped both halves on the floor. He looked at his mother, still sitting by the window, still not crying, still nodding that slow, terrible nod. Then he walked out. Let me tell you what happened after, because this story doesn't end in that fellowship hall. Thomas drove for 3 hours that night, south, toward Texas, though he didn't know why. Maybe he was looking for Ray Kellerman's family. Maybe he was just running from the truth. He stopped at a gas station outside of Beatrice and sat in the parking lot until dawn. Linda found him there. She had called every hospital and police station in 3 counties before thinking to check the route south. She pulled up beside his truck, got out and stood in the cold November morning, waiting. Thomas told her everything. The letters, the partnership, the betrayal, the 34 years of lies. Linda listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she asked one question. What are you going to do? Thomas didn't have an answer. Not yet. They drove home together, leaving his truck at the gas station. The farmhouse was empty. Margaret had gone to stay with her sister, and Thomas spent the next 3 days alone in the house where he'd grown up, reading Ray Kellerman's letters over and over, trying to understand how his father could have lived with what he'd done. On the 4th day, he started making phone calls. Ray Kellerman had never married, but he had a younger sister. Her name was Dorothy, and she had married a man named Bill Patterson. They had 2 sons. One of them, Michael Patterson, was still farming, barely on 120 acres in Antelope County, struggling to hold on during the tail end of the farm crisis. Thomas found the number through directory assistance. He called 3 times before anyone answered. The voice on the other end was cautious, tired. Patterson residence. Is this Michael Patterson? Who's asking? Thomas took a breath. My name is Thomas Hendricks. I believe my father owed your family 200 acres. The line was silent for a long time. Then Michael Patterson said, I think you better come up here and say that in person. The meeting happened in the Pattersons' kitchen in early December. Thomas drove up alone, carrying the shoebox and a folder of legal documents he'd had prepared by a lawyer in Omaha. Michael Patterson was about Thomas's age, mid-50s, with Ray Kellerman's dark hair and his mother Dorothy's sharp eyes. His wife Carol served coffee and then left the 2 men alone. Thomas set the shoebox on the table and told the whole story. The partnership, the accident, The 34 years of silence. The letters. The will he had torn in half. When he was finished, Michael Patterson stared at the shoebox for a long time. My grandmother, Ray's mother, she never stopped talking about this, said there was land in Nebraska that should have been ours. My mother thought she was just confused. Old stories. You know how it is. She wasn't confused, Thomas said. She was right. Michael opened the shoebox. He read the first letter from his Uncle Ray to his grandmother, dated April 1956, and his hands began to shake. I've had papers drawn up, Thomas said. 200 acres. The east half of the farm. The land your uncle's money bought. I'm signing it over to you. No charge. It's what should have happened 34 years ago. Michael looked up from the letters. You're serious. I am. And that land is worth. In today's market, even depressed as it is, that's got to be close to $500,000. I know what it's worth, and you're just going to give it away. Because of some letters. Thomas thought about his father, standing at the mailbox every October. He thought about Ray Kellerman, 27 years old, dead on Highway 77. His dreams of partnership and family and land dying with him. I'm giving it away because it was never mine to begin with. The transfer took 3 months to complete. There were legal complications, the will Thomas had torn up, the questions about the estate, the need to establish the historical claim. But by March of 1992, 200 acres of Hendricks farmland officially became Patterson farmland. The county couldn't believe it. Stories spread through the diners and feed stores like wildfire. Most people thought Thomas had lost his mind. A few, the older ones, the ones who remembered Ray Kellerman, just nodded quietly and said it was about time. Margaret Hendricks died in 1994, 3 years after her husband. She never spoke to Thomas about the letters or the transfer, but she left him a note, found in her bedside table after she passed. It said, "Your father was not a bad man. He was a weak man who made a terrible choice and spent his whole life trying to make up for it the wrong way. You did what he couldn't. I am proud of you." Thomas kept farming his remaining 200 acres until 2003, when he turned 65 and sold the operation to his son Daniel. The price of land had recovered by then, and Daniel was able to expand, buying some adjacent acreage from a retiring neighbor, but he never bought the Patterson land. That boundary line, the one Thomas had drawn in 1992, remained fixed. 2 farms, side by side, run by families that had been connected by a handshake 60 years before and finally properly divided. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. What would you have done? You're standing in that fellowship hall with a will in your hands. A will that gives you 400 acres of paid-off land during one of the worst agricultural crises in American history. Land that would set your children and grandchildren up for generations. And you've just learned that half of it was stolen from a dead man's family. That your father, the man you respected, the man whose philosophy you built your life around, was living a lie. Do you tear up the will? Do you give away $500,000 because of letters in a shoebox? Do you sacrifice your children's inheritance to pay your father's debt? Thomas Hendricks did. Some people called him a fool. Some people called him a saint. Most people didn't know what to call him. But here's what I know. Thomas Hendricks slept soundly every night for the rest of his life. He looked at his land, his 200 acres, and he knew that every inch of it was truly his. Not stolen, not borrowed, not built on the bones of a betrayed friend. Clean land. Honest land. And maybe that's worth more than 400 acres. Maybe the weight of a secret is heavier than any mortgage. Maybe the real debt isn't the money we owe to banks. It's the truth we owe to the dead. If stories like this resonate with you, stories about the choices that define us, the secrets that families carry, the land that holds our history, consider subscribing. There are more tales to tell, more buried truths waiting to break through the soil. Thomas Hendricks is 86 years old now. He still lives in Cedar Bluffs, in a small house in town, not far from the farm where he was born. His son Daniel runs the operation these days. His grandchildren are the 5th generation to work that Nebraska soil. Last October, Thomas made a drive he hasn't made in years. He went out to the old property line, the one that separates Hendricks land from Patterson land, and he stood there for a while, looking across the fields. The mailbox is still there, the old one, the one his father built in 19... Thomas walked over and ran his fingers across the weathered wood. The initials are almost impossible to read now. WH and RK, faded by 60 years of Nebraska weather. He stood there until the sun went down. Then he got in his truck and drove home. Some debts you carry your whole life. Some debts your children carry for you. And some debts, the ones that really matter, can only be paid by telling the truth, even if it takes 34 years, even if it costs you 200 acres, even if you have to tear up your father's will in front of everyone you know. The land remembers. It always remembers. It always remembers. And now, so do you.